understand this as a sort of case of fragmentation, whatever fragmentation means. It's a case, as he said, of the status quo being sort of replicated through some new component of something that's already in existence. And that leads me to a couple of comments about consequences. It may very well be that increased complexity, fragmentation, if you prefer that term, is, at least under some consequences, really about solving complex governance problems. And particularly, it seems to me that, here let me introduce another distinction. If you draw a distinction between regimes in the sense of operating arrangements and constitutive institutions, that is the sort of underlying fundamental substructure of the institutional substructure of society, when you have this fragmentation or complexity in an issue area, but built on a pretty well developed and fairly stable institutional substructure, it may be that this is really about working out the details, working out the characteristics of, or the requirements of solving a particular problem. But as Jeff and Sylvia remind us, of course, it's also the case that the consequences may very well have to do with the exercise of power, and it's something we've done not a sufficiently good job, let me not say a bad job, but not a sufficiently good job in the regime's literature is sort of accommodating and understanding the role of power. And it very well be that this, in terms of consequences, is a case of the exercise of power. And then the question is, what is the relationship of power, as they point out, to legitimacy? I have no difficulty with the conclusion that they arrive at that the APP and the FG8 so forth are less legitimate than the UNFCCC. But the question is, what difference does that make? And in any case, legitimacy in whose eyes? I mean, is this legitimacy in the eyes of all of us, or legitimacy in the eyes of certain kinds of players in the system? But surely when it's an exercise of power, the consequences of it can be, and often are, quite different from fragmentation complexity than would be the case otherwise. And then just finally on responses, it seems to me that the question, or what to think about responses, depends very much on our analysis of the causes and consequences in any given case. Insofar as it's a question, as Sebastian suggested in some of his remarks about division of labor, where you are creating a governance system which requires either or both functional or spatial differentiation, then it may be a kind of a sort of an engineering problem to say, well, let's see, we've got to work out how these various pieces fit together. It's a kind of a design question of, it may require a certain amount of trial and error to get the system in its various pieces kind of in place in a way that is both effective and efficient and hopefully equitable as well. But the response in the situation, if that's the fundamental story, if that's the fundamental sort of problem at hand, the response then is a very different one than if the fundamental story is really about conflict and the pursuit of diverging interests and the desire of some players to improve the outcome from the point of view of their particular concerns. When that is the case, then it seems to me that one needs to move into various kinds of things relating to power, conflict resolution, whether or not one can construct mechanisms in an institutional context that are able to accommodate divergent interests of one kind or another. The climate change case is a tough case because it seems to me that maybe Doha points the way, I don't think so, but it seems to me that this is a case in which there are fundamental conflicts and they are not being resolved either through the UNFCCC or through this unilateral kind of arrangements. And it remains to be seen if some kind of resolution can be achieved before we go over the cliff, so to say, that is beyond the point of no return with respect to the achieving what Article 2 of the UNFCCC says we should be trying avoiding dangerous interference in the climate system. So anyway, let me just conclude on that note and say it seems to me we have still some work to do to sort of clarify the basic kind of analytic focus of this research program, which clearly does relate in an interesting way to the theme of architecture, and then it will be easier to fold into the analysis, I think, some of the specific case studies, such as the one that Jeff and Sylvia have done, and the one that Sebastian has done. Thank you.
Thank you, Oren. There's already quite a bit of food for thought, but I want to add to that before I get the floor back to the speakers, if there are any questions in the room. And I see at least 2 hands. I'll start with you, sir. Please introduce yourself and try to keep your questions concise.
My name is Yoshi Nishimura. I used to be ambassador of Japan in charge of climate negotiation. I have been in all these forums, all these forums you have mentioned. As far as I'm concerned, the most important, urgent governance issue for climate change is not so much whether one institution is legitimate up against the other, as it is about whether the present game can achieve 2 key crucial objectives, and that is 2 degrees Celsius, stop it before 2 degrees. 2 degrees is not achievable, maybe 2.5 degrees, for example, and raise enough money to end poverty. So these are the 2 questions which we have to deal with. But I'm sure you all know the present game. If you look at Article 3.1 of Kyoto Protocol, it says it's only for 5% reduction, a tiny 5% reduction. And that is the whole Kyoto scheme was designed to achieve that tiny reduction. And with regard to financing, we all know, we have to recognize, there is no substantive hope whatsoever for that large money to come forward as all these economic difficulties we are seeing. So the basic question I think we really have to ask is whether the present game is apt to deal with those 2 things. And from now on, we really have to deal with gigaton gap, and this over decades to come, maybe through 2050. Whether this present game, in my view, can be characterized as government-centric, ambition-driven system. Do you think you can achieve, stop it by 2 degrees or before 2 degrees by government-centric ambitious